Hi, you've reached the Talking Racewalking podcast. It's all about racewalking, of course. It's talking to racewalkers from around the world about racewalking. Join me, Noel Payne, a amateur racewalker in Canada, as I talk to elites, Olympians, record holders, masters walkers, and anybody who's out walking as fast as they can. Hi, so this is a section where I'd actually be talking to someone, a race walker. So this is where you can come in. If you know a race walker, you're a race walker, and you have an amazing story, I want to hear from you. So reach out, let's chat, let's get walking and talking. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Talking Racewalking. I'm going a little nerdy on this episode. No offense to all my guests, but I think we'd all agree that we probably fall into that category. I'm defining this podcast as racewalking, its definition, biomechanics, and stuff. That's the technical title for this podcast. I've got a great panel of guests here. I've got with me Dr. Brian Hanley from the UK. Sports, exercise, and biomechanics leads Beckett University in the UK. Great expert to have on with us. I've got Dave McGovern from racewalking.org, racewalker and coach, master's degree in sports science, author of a bunch of racewalking books. I've got Jeff Salvage, racewalk.com, so competing websites, racewalker and coach, author of racewalking books as well, and has amazing resources on YouTube for racewalkers. To plug in for that. And finally, I've got Ian Watley, a UK origins race walker. So competitive race walk, came to the US from the UK to set up an applied sciences section to the Nike lab. So they pulled him over to the US. He's been there ever since, as far as I know. He also coaches, has some great resources on YouTube, and can be described, at least while he's working, as a biomechanist and a shoe designer. So he's got a great perspective, lots of experience, and has a lot of competitive, a good number of competitive years race walking as well. So welcome to everyone. They're all waving and nodding, which you can't hear on a podcast, but
Thank you.
They are there. So, gentlemen, thank you for coming onto the podcast. I'll try and sort of point to or ask a specific question at each one of you so that we're not all jumping on things. To anybody listening, this is a chance to kind of talk about the nerdy stuff of race walking. I contacted all these experts and race walkers to talk about race walking itself, some of the biomechanics, and what makes race walking and not power walking or not running. What defines it? And is it the fastest way to walk? So that leads me into the first question. Is race walking the fastest and most efficient way to walk as fast as possible? So for this one, I'm going to start off. I'm going to start the ball rolling, and I'm going to throw it to our gentleman in the UK, Dr. Brian Hanley. Brian, what's your input on the first question?
Well, I don't think race walking is the first thing. So
he has thrown down the gauntlet, gentlemen, right off the bat. All right.
So I think race walking is a very inefficient way of moving at that speed. You're much better off running. And the reason I say it's not walking is because you have to straighten your knee, and nobody doing normal walking will do that. So it's obviously a very fast way of moving in terms of gait, and not as fast as running, in general. But it's not the fastest way of walking, no. It's a very fast movement, but it would not be considered walking by people who study walking.
Okay, interesting one there. Okay, so I'm going to, now that Brian has thrown that down, I'm going to throw this over to, let's try Dave this time. So Dave, what's your take on this? So we've kind of gone from asking the question, and then Brian saying, race walking, not really perhaps walking by its definition. And then going back to the question as well for you, is it the fastest way to walk? So your turn.
It really depends on where you put the definition. So I agree with Brian that there are three modes of progression that we think about: running, walking, and race walking. And race walking is neither running nor walking. So it depends on where you put that line. We have the IAAF definition of what we're doing, but is it walking? I don't think it is walking. It is the fastest way to move, probably without running. But even then, you have to define your terms. What is running and what is walking? You know, according to the dictionary definition of walking, a lot of people who are walking are not following that definition. If you look at the dictionary definition of running, a lot of people who are running are not following that definition. I saw a guy yesterday out on the bike path, and I'm sure if I asked him what you're doing, he would say he was running, but he was just kind of shuffling along, kind of a, I don't want to say ballistic because it wasn't even that ballistic, but kind of a little bit of a bounce to a walk is what he was doing. But I'm sure if you asked him, he would call it running. So, but if you're confining things to what you would call walking, the reason race walking is the Olympics, it's the fastest way of getting from point A to point B under the constraints of those rules. But the rules keep changing.
Yeah,
So,
true
and the
enough.
athletes keep changing, and the athletes keep changing as well to try to, you know, obey the rules, but at the very limit of what those rules allow. And then it comes down to what the judges are going to allow.
Perfect. No, I love it. Ian, I'm going to let you weigh on this one too. And I'm going to just to mix it up a little bit, I'm going to say, what about power walking? So between race walking and power walking, if we're talking about what's the most efficient way and fastest way to walk, is power walking faster or is race walking faster? I'll throw that in there to mix it up.
Yeah, I think this is a great debate, and I appreciate Brian pointing out the obvious: race walking isn't walking. No, it certainly isn't. So we all agree on that. We can go home. I'd also say there's a bit of a problem in that we use the word running. What we mean is running races. So when we look at a running race, you can race walk in a running race. You can power walk. You can shuffle. You can jog. You can't use rollerblades. So it's really a case of bipedal locomotion, getting around the place just using your feet, no skateboards allowed. And as a subset of that, there's race walking, and running is freestyle. What they mean when they say running race doesn't necessarily mean running, as everyone's pointed out. It means it's freestyle, go as you please, which is what they used to call race walking, just to make things confusing. So I've recently been working towards coming up with rules to differentiate power walking from race walking. And the idea is that it is a simplified form that would be accessible to people who have knee problems or motor problems with their gait. So, for example, very young children or some para-Olympians or very elderly people who have knee deformities or injuries so that they cannot comply with the race walking rules. And I drew some fancy Venn diagrams, and because this is audio, I'm drawing them with my hands and I'm going to put them right up on the screen, which is really helpful. I think of the possibilities that race walking could be a subpart of power walking, or the two could overlap a little, or they can be completely separate. And it just depends how you write the rules, which is the point that I think Dave and Brian have made, is it depends how you define it. Is it the fastest way to walk? It depends what you mean by walk, doesn't it?
Oh, mixing it up. I like this. This is interesting. I like this is getting good. And I've got one more person to weigh on this as well. So, Jeff, what's your take on the comments so far, and what's your opinion on things?
So I agree with everything that's been said. As a college professor, I'm going to change the question.
I love it.
So this really started from a discussion of, is having the straightened knee in race walking an advantage?
You're right? Running into my second question, Jeff. Come on, geez.
I cheat.
I know.
So this is how I get ahead. And I'm coming at this of late much more from a judge perspective than a coach or a biomechanic expert. My three peers here totally outweigh my biomechanical knowledge, so I defer to them for any definitions and analysis there. What I have been doing is visual observations of elite race walkers from a judge's perspective and trying to define, as Dave correctly pointed out, we have rules, are they following them? And if the judges don't make calls, then why shouldn't coaches coach their athletes to push the limits right to that edge? And that's what we're seeing. So my initial comment that I think spurred a lot of this discussion was that a little bit of bent knee is probably, or is advantageous, because we see people in elite competitions not straightening to 180 degrees. Brian, I think your study said visible is at 178 or 177, right? And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like what you're studying in the lab, you got to put a little fudge factor for the judges in the real world when you have 10 walkers around each other, bad lighting, things like that. So we've been saying, you know, hey, we should be able to pick it up if it's 175 degrees. Well, there are walkers at the World Championships, some got called, some did not, who have a bent knee between 170 and 175 degrees. I have to believe that's an advantage. Otherwise, they would be straightening their knee, right? So, but if you take that too far to an extreme, at some point, as everyone pointed out, they turn into something called a runner that we haven't really defined. And if I race walk with somebody who I'm teaching, I have no problem keeping up. If they go to a power walk where they're bending their knee to get an advantage to go faster, sometimes if I'm power walking, I can't keep up with them because I'm not trained as this nebulous definition of a power walker. So it all comes back to, we have defined rules for race walking. We have subjective application of it by judges that we're trying to now make more objective. But we don't have that for running because it's freestyle, and we don't have it for power walking because the current, quote, official rules are nebulous and contradictory and have no real measurable value.
Interesting. I'm loving this. Jeff has really jumped into the second question, which is really kind of bringing power walking in terms of, with power walking, of course, there's an idea that you don't have to bring that leg 180 degrees straight as it comes underneath you, for all those listening. And which brings up that question, of course, I'm not aware of what the power walking records are. So as well, I would assume that the power walking records, probably because of the participants mainly, are not as fast as race walking. But that does bring up the question of, is a slightly bent knee, which would fall into what we would call power walking, is that either make it easier to go faster? Is it more efficient? Does anybody want to jump on that one?
Give it to Brian. Give it to Brian. He knows.
Dave's got his hand up, but I'll throw it to Brian, the guy in the lab. I'll throw it to Brian to start off with.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing to say is actually to Ian and Jeff have made a good point. They've used the word freestyle because there is no rule of running in the World Athletics rules. There's no rule. So it's the good comparison is with swimming. So freestyle, there's 4 swimming strokes in the Olympics, and one of them is freestyle, which most people assume means front crawl, but actually you can do any stroke you want. But most of them do the front crawl because it's the fastest. All the other 3 strokes have got rules. So freestyle swimming has no rule in terms of how you do the stroke. It's the same with running. There's no rule. You can have double support. You can have massive flight time. You can have bent knees. You can have straight. You can have anything you want in running. There's no rule defining it in world athletics. But race walking does have a rule. Now I have to admit that we don't have power walking competitions here in the UK or Ireland where I'm from. I've seen people doing it, but I've never heard of a competition. So maybe it's a bigger thing in the US. I did judge though with some colleagues here at the World Transplant Games, which has all sorts of events for transplant people, and we judged the walk, and we decided we were going to go with a simple rule of no loss of contact, because we wouldn't expect them to have straightened knees, and it was fairly straightforward, and you know, most people just walk like normal. There was one person who was really, really fast, who had been a proper race walker, and he did the proper technique, but although we weren't really assessing his knee. Is there an advantage to bending your knee? Of course there is. Yes, it's massive advantage. So I don't want to get into the massive biomechanics of it, but basically, bending your knee during walking reduces the energy cost. So if you can't bend the knee, lots of other things have to happen to reduce the disadvantage. And these are the things like dropping your pelvis to one side, which is why you get the sort of wiggly motion of race walkers. You've got to sort of have a straighter walking path. A lot of these things are done to compensate for the lack of bending your knee. And in the lab, we have tested some people who weren't intentionally bending their knee, but the results showed they were. And when I did the analysis, the amount of muscle work done is quite reduced, so it's a lot more efficient. So there's no doubt about it. The straight knee is really what defines race walking from other kinds of gait. And if you remove that, then it's not race walking anymore. It becomes a mixture of some other version of running or walking. So yes, it makes a big difference.
That's perfect, Brian. And I think it actually, I'm not sure if it clears things up or make it muddier. And I know Ian is jumping and itching. Oh, and maybe Dave's, they're both, I don't know. They're both, we got fingers pointing and everything else. Before we get these guys unleash them, what I want to say is I find it interesting now, because now I think we've opened up that whole question of why then are we race walking? How the heck did we get to the point of putting a straight leg in if we're trying to walk as fast as possible? That's a strange one. I find that interesting. I'm gonna I know Dave had his hand up earlier, so I'm gonna let him jump in first.
You've established the pattern of U.S. accent, European accent, U.S. accent. We're gonna stick to that. Again, it's where you put the terms. Race walking with that straight leg is definitely, in my definition, faster than power walking. But where do you put that line, though? I mean, I have seen some stuff at my clinics. I'm not going to mention any names there, but there is a guy on YouTube that I've never met. He goes by Power Walking Pops. He's flat out running. He's trying to set the sprint power walking record of for 100 meters. And he's down to 15 seconds or so. I can't remember exactly where it is, but I mean, he's just flat out running. What he's doing is definitely more efficient and faster than race walking, but it's not walking, it's not race walking, it's not even power walking. He's just running. So it really depends on where you put that defining line. As I guess Brian and Jeff were saying, that slightly bent knee that looks like race walking is an advantage over race walking. It's also cheating. So it depends on what the judges are able to pick up on. But if you're comparing, really obeying the rules of race walking and really obeying the rules of power walking, race walking with a straight leg is faster. But once you cross that line into something that just really becomes running, as Brian mentioned, where you're using the springing effect rather than that vaulting, that levering effect of the straight leg, then it's going to become more efficient. But race walking under the rules compared to power walking under the rules, I think race walking is faster. Otherwise, people would be power walking in the Olympics, not race walking.
Can I ask Dave a follow-up? So you've got a lot of anecdotal evidence on this. I've got data in my head, and it'll be interesting to see if we land to the same place. From people in your clinics or marathon training and all that, who were not race walkers, who were not running, but legitimately trying to power walk, health walk, whatever you want to call it, go 10K or further, what's the fastest per mile pace do you think a power walker could sustain?
Yeah, I got to go kilometers here. God, I'm hosting from Canada. God, give me a break.
Yeah, I mean, really power walking, 7.5 minutes a K, about maybe down to about 7. If they're really, well, I've seen 7. Getting under 7, truly just power walking is really difficult until it becomes, power walking Pops, who's just flat out running, and nobody would look at him and say, "Oh, that guy's walking really fast," except himself. I mean, he's trying to he's claiming himself as a power walker, but he just isn't. I don't think anybody would say he's a power walker. I think really power walking about 7 minutes a kilometer. That's about 11:15 a mile.
Okay.
I've seen 10, but really sustaining it. Most people have a really great difficulty getting under 7 minutes a K, or about 11 minutes a mile.
So I have converted to kilometers. I had 6.8. So we're right, within a rounding error of each other. And that sort of anecdotally answers the question. Because
Yeah.
you see average beginner race walkers, you know, sub 6 per kilometer.
Oh yeah.
Well,
Interesting.
we're supposed to be really nerdy on this. I'm going to mention R. McNeill Alexander. There's always been this theory that there's a certain speed at which animals change their gait pattern. They reach a speed at which they have to alter their gait pattern. They will attempt to walk or go forward with the lowest energy cost they can for the speed they need to be going. And you can calculate from the acceleration due to gravity and the length of the limb and so on, where there should be a transition point where we see gait change. And I'm wondering if there's something, if we had enough definition, if we could actually find a point where you go from running to power walking, and then another change point where power walking is less efficient than race walking. Anyway, I'll just throw that out there, and Brian can ask for a grant and do the research. But
Don't need to.
The other thing I was going to just put in was we changed the rules. Me personally, I changed the rules. No, the IAAF, as they were then, now the World Athletics, changed the rules of race walking in 1993 to change the moment at which your leg had to be straight. You didn't have to land with a straight leg. Your leg had to be straight for at least the moment when it was vertically upright underneath your body. Okay, so what they were, as I understand it, the change was made for cosmetic reasons. Bob Bowman was in charge of the group making the changes, and they were talking about changing the rules for shoes. So I got dragged into it. And it was mainly for cosmetic reasons. They could not give me a biomechanical reason why they wanted to change the moment your leg had to be straight. Now, why, I asked, does it have to be straight when it's upright? Well, that's so that you can't push off once your leg's gone underneath you. And their sort of lay description of what running is you land, your leg bends, goes underneath your bend, you straighten it up again, and it shoves you forward. So if you make them keep it straight for the moment it's upright under them, they can't push off behind. All right. Now that probably horrifies Brian.
No, that's true. But that is true.
No,
What,
If your leg is straight and underneath you, your knee cannot push you forwards. All of the push forwards in race walking comes from your hips and your ankle. The knee is effectively redundant in race walking, but it's absolutely crucial in running. So by forcing them to have a straight knee, you do completely change the gait, completely change it.
And jumping in here, would that then make race walking closer to walking as opposed to running?
Yes. So I'm just really quickly tell you about one of my PhD students from a few years ago. She's graduating now, Helen Gravestock. We did a study. We compared walking, race walking, and running in the same group of race walkers. And when we did the comparisons in terms of angles and all those kind of things, race walking was much closer to walking than it was to running, even though they were going at running speeds, if that makes sense, when we compared. So what Ian was talking about in terms of transition between different forms of gait, there was a nice study by two guys called Ziv and Rothstein about 15 years ago, looking at what we call the preferred transition speed, which is when you go from walking to running, and it's about 8 kilometers an hour. And the reason you do that, and the reason why people can't power walk very quickly, is because it hurts your shins far too much. Especially the shins are the ones that really go. And even race walkers have that, but they tend to be better, for coping with that pain, or it gets less painful because they're trained for it. So I think, I know Dave was saying race walking is more efficient than power walking, but like you said, it depends on how you define power walking. At least with race walking, there's a definition. And I imagine most race walkers have never tried power walking because why would they? It's not an Olympic sport. But maybe if they did, the power walking record would be even faster. It's hard to know. But what Ian was saying is right. The straightening knee thing does stop you pushing off with your knee, which is what they do in running, but they don't do in normal walking or in race walking. So I know we said earlier race walking isn't walking, but it is closer to walking. it is closer to walking for me.
Excellent. No, perfect. I'm going to wrap up this podcast fairly soon. I'm going to try and throw a different question that I didn't write down for you guys before. So it's a new one. So no cheating from Jeff on this one. But I also want to put a plug in for the next podcast, or next couple, actually. I had a chat with Matthew Algeo, who wrote the book Pedestrianism, which I think is also interesting because it talks about the early start of pedestrianism, which also, I think we often talk about it in terms of walking. But when they talked about walking in the early, late 1700s, early 1800s as well, pedestrianism often described running as well. They weren't clearly just saying walking, though a lot of the really long distance events were pure walking. And I would have loved to have seen how some of those guys going, 50, 100 miles or 6 days, what technique they used to walk most efficiently and fast. That would have been interesting as well, because they really took it to the extreme.
Wait, just
Dave's got a quick question.
Dave.
Go ahead, Dave.
Dave's
Well,
that
they
old.
actually had two kinds of races. I mean, we're talking the 6-day races in the
Yep.
late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. There were two kinds of races. There were go as you please races, and then as Ian said, and then there were
Walking.
fair heel and toe races. But initially, in the go as you please races, in the Astley belt races, it took years before runners could beat walkers. I mean, because the distances were so long that the walkers had an advantage over those very, very long distances. And then with a lot of prize money, training, runners figured eventually we're going to be able to beat these walkers by running. And eventually they did. And so then in the very late I think it was 1878, they started doing these fair heel and toe races where they said, you have to walk. You can't run anymore because they were gaining an advantage by running. But for the very, very long distances, walking was more efficient than running.
No, exactly.
And
Sorry,
I would qualify efficiency, and again, I'm not the one to answer, but if you're talking about walking as fast as you can for a mile, or you're talking about a 6-day event.
No, 6-day event.
Right. I'm saying the efficiency question might be answered differently.
Yeah, I agree here too. Yeah. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because I know you guys have got things to do, but I did have one follow-up, which I think ties into current events and the current state of race walking. We've talked about what's walking, what's power walking, what's race walking, what's running. When we talk about the definition of race walking, what is, as people have gotten me, I'm relatively new to this, but race walkers now, I mean, I think everybody can see it. They're coming up off the ground more than they ever used to. I mean, I saw the big race between Jeff and Dave just recently on YouTube, and you guys are really trying to stick to the ground there. Good technique, but really smooth, and you can see it. Ian was there as well, and I do believe, I don't want to start a big thing going on here, but I think Jeff beat Dave on video there. The boys had to produce more videos for Dave to have one where he's beaten Jeff. But anyways, but you guys are really, the technique was good, but there really was I didn't see any fear of anybody getting called for lifting in that race. But on some of the current races, the technique has changed a fair amount. And I mean, there does seem to be a lot of airtime there that we weren't seeing, say, back in the 80s. Does that change what we're calling race walking? Is that causing a problem in terms of, the whole 1 foot in the ground, the bad leg, how much is that changing things? Does anybody want to jump on that one?
As they say in Congress, my name was evoked. Just incidentally, I don't want to get into the trash talking too much, but I think incidentally, today's rules, I don't know if Ian would have made it. I think it might have been the frame rate, it might, because it was a little jumpy, but Ian's knees looked a little bent, from heel contact through the vertical, but those weren't the rules then. He could have a straight leg under the body. He could land slightly bent. And I think that rule changed, as Ian said, for cosmetic reasons. I think, you want everybody kind of doing the same thing. And then I really think it was when Daniel Plaza won the 20K in Barcelona. He really had a badly bent knee, until under the vertical upright position. I think the Russians kind of started with that technique. figuring if you shorten that lever a little bit, you don't have that long leg out in front of your body in the way. So they landed on a bent knee and then popped it straight under. Plaza won the 20K in the Barcelona Olympics like that. He looked really different from a lot of the other, walkers and what our conception of race walking is. And then shortly thereafter, the rule changed. Anyway, not having anything to do with the end. So I'm fixating on this race in
I know.
and I was in a real down phase, but I was going for it. I was going for the win. I mean, the thing about these off-distance national championships, it's winner and then first, second, third loser. So, all right, Jeff got first loser in that race, and I got second loser. But I was going for the win and didn't have the base behind me. I crashed a little bit. But what was the question?
Yeah, the race is on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, go find Jeff Salvage on YouTube, and he has posted it recently. So the question of, is the increased air time that people are getting right now, is that starting to change what we're calling race walking now? Is that creating a problem?
I think, as Brian said, the thing that really makes race walking is that straight leg. Certainly flight phase plays into it. I think there is at some point excessive flight phase where it just looks bad when people think that walking has to be 1 foot on the ground at all times. But I think the visible eye definition has served us well until cameras could pick up big flight times. And now that people are off the ground 45, 50 milliseconds and not getting caught, it is a real public relations problem for us. So whether it's change, in my heart, it doesn't really change it. It doesn't make it not race walking anymore. And I've always been wary of not being one of those old guys that say, we used to walk a certain way and everybody got to walk that way. I think it's still race walking. I think it's still a beautiful event. But I think these flight phases are really going to kill us in terms of public relations and trying to keep it in the Olympics when they don't want us in the Olympics anymore because we're not obeying what people think walking is.
So it was really about that, the air time. Is it changing?
Yeah, the air time isn't changing. It shouldn't be changing. We've defined it as being the visual threshold, the threshold at which there's so much flight time, so much loss of contact that the unaided human eye can detect it. I don't care if you can pick it up on videos and stuff. It's still probably less than maybe 20 or 25% the amount of flight time in running, if we could only define running. Okay, somebody who's out running a 3-hour marathon is off the floor for probably 4 or 5 times as long as a race walker at the point they become visible, losing contact. Now, what we need to do is to have something that takes us away from human judges, because human perceptions vary. They change by the environment, they change by the color of the backdrop, the amount of light, the age of the observer, the color of the shoe they're looking at. There's lots of silly little factors. Are the people in a big pack? What needs to be developed and might be in process, if I could tell you about it, are electronic sensors that will be put on the shoes, hardly weigh anything, and gather data that shows how long people are off the floor for each step and relays it electronically so that the judges don't have to try to look at every single step. We have a device that's doing it. You can't jog around a corner where nobody's watching you. It's with you all the time, this device. We would need to set that at a level that is the equivalent of human eye judging, because if I'm in some rural place, I don't have access to electronics. I, as a coach, need to be able to tell people, well, you'll be within the rules when you get to World Championships and they start using these devices. So we have to make sure we don't change it to some glued to the floor thing where it's zero loss of contact time. That would take us back before pedestrianism. It's a silly level to set. So we really need to have continuity, and we need to have reliable, repeatable measures of loss of contact. And that's what's being developed, if I could even mention it. And I think there's tremendous progress. I've been fortunate to see some of the results of it, and our devices are imminent.
Excellent. And
Let-
I've got Jeff here too. So Jeff, did you want to weigh in before we tie things up?
I did. So let me play devil's advocate for a moment, Minister of Silly Walks. So I'm not in any way suggesting that we go to 0 milliseconds, but I would argue that if we did, there's no elite walker who's going to go to the World Championships that doesn't have access to a cell phone. A cell phone could be placed at on the level of a track or the road, and you can measure loss of contact down to 3 or 4 milliseconds, right, with a cell phone. So
You're talking
we
video,
could do
video footage,
video-wise, right? So we could do it. Whether we should do it is a debate that we don't want to get into today at the end of our talk. I did want to qualify what everybody has been talking about is visible loss of contact.
Yeah.
Which Brian studied in the lab at 40 to 45 milliseconds. I would argue, I think Brian would agree, that in the real world, that might be 50. Because what we're talking about is looking at one factor of why a walker might be have a visible loss of contact, which is milliseconds. But the other factor, or one of the other factors, and maybe many, is how the foot travels. And someone who kicks the foot very, very highly in the air is going to make it easier to see that visible loss of contact than someone who keeps their foot lower. So there are a few factors. The problem with current race walking is that we have pushed from the threshold being around 50 to the threshold being at 60 and beyond. And recently I have seen Facebook video, which objectively is horrible because it's at 30 frames per second. Subjectively, with a little bit of objectiveness, I have downloaded said videos, put them into video software, done frame by frame loose analysis because there's not enough data points. And it's very clear that people are way over 60, and it does change the biomechanics of what you're seeing to where it does not look like race walking anymore. It looks like straight-legged running. So I do think if you push to too much loss of contact, it changes what we would call it. And that is a danger to our sport, and why we've been taking steps to re-educate judges, educate new judges, that you should be able to detect this amount of loss of contact if you're going to be an international judge.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect way to end, tie things up, and perhaps a completely different podcast on airtime, perhaps. So I want to thank everybody for joining me. Ian, Jeff, Dave, and Brian from the UK. Everybody, thank you so much for this chat. Everybody else out there, find these guys, racewalking.org, racewalk.com. Ian's on YouTube as well. And go Google Mr. Hanley in the UK as well. He's doing some interesting research. So thank you again, and stay tuned, subscribe, and wait for more exciting Talking Race Walking episodes. Thank you.
That's it, folks. The end of the podcast. No walkers have been harmed in the recording of this podcast. And of course, at the moment, we have no sponsors or supporters at this point to fund all this amazing podcasting. But if you're out there and have a race walk company that produces some sort of race walk apparel product or something you think race walkers would love, get hold of us. We'd love to have you on board. Give us a holler.